Chapter 28 Even as You and I Part 1 For Pat, life had become a serial of excitement. The curves of the dullest road were intriguing because she might meet Harris J. Hines around them. The prosiest sermon good old Mr. Paxton might preach became eloquent with her eyes exchanged messages with Harris's across the aisle. She blushed furiously when he entered a room unexpectedly, or when he handed her a book from the Sunday school library, or held a door open for her to pass through. His manners were so courtly. She marked a little ring around the date in the calendar in her glory box on which he first called her dear. He had given her the calendar, a calendar in the shape of a pink rose with gilt greetings on its petal months. To mark your happy days on, he told her. Frightfully sentimental, jeered Winnie, but Judy was quite enraptured with it. I do be kind of liking a sentimental beau, Patsy. They do mostly seem to be two hard boils nowadays. Pat had one of her moments of beauty when he told her he had been watching her window light half the night. It was really Judy's light, but neither Harris nor Pat ever knew that. It was thrilling to discover that he liked cats, and was not in the least annoyed when Boldenbad rubbed against his best trousers and haired them. Really, his temper must be angelic. Pat would not have been surprised to find he had wings under his navy blue coat. And it was the delight of all delights to go to the movies at Silverbridge with him. A theatre had been started in the shabby old community hall in Silverbridge, and pictures were shown Wednesday and Saturday nights. Judy was persuaded to go once, but never again. She said it was too upsetting. Pat was sure she could never forget the first time Harris took her. "Has anyone ever told you how lovely you were?" he whispered, as he helped her on with her coat in the Silver Bush kitchen. "Lots of people," laughed Pat mendaciously, with an impish light in her eyes. Oh, that's the way to answer them," exulted Judy to herself in the pantry. "You won't be finding the Silverbush girls too easy, Mr. Hines." Pat felt as sparkling as the night. They went to Silverbridge by a short cut up the hill, past the Longhouse, and down over the fields to the river. The white sorcery of winter was all around them, and her arm was tucked warmly in the curve of Harris's arm. Just a little ahead were Sid and Betts. Sid was really having quite a case on Betts, much to Pat's delight. "I couldn't dream of anything more perfect," she told Judy. Oh, Bets'll be having a dozen other beaux yet afore she settles down. Like yourself," retorted Judy. Whereat Pat went off in high dudgeon. Well, old folks couldn't understand. "I wonder who was the first person to think the new moon beautiful," said Pat dreamily. "I've no eyes for the moon tonight," said Harris significantly. Pat felt faintly chilled. The implication of Harris's remark was complimentary, but that slim crescent hanging over the snowy spruces that were like silver palms was so exquisite that Pat wanted Harris to share its loveliness with her. Hilary would have. Then she was horrified at such a thought. She forgot her momentary disloyalty in the theatre. It was so wonderful. Pat would have worked that word to death that winter if she had not given it an occasional rest by using marvelous. Crowds were around them, but they were alone in the scented darkness. Once Harris took her hand and held it. When she tried to pull it away, "Say please," whispered Harris. Pat did not say please. The only fly in her ointment was the beauty of the screen sirens. Did they ever sneeze? Have cold sores? Swallow a crumb the wrong way? How could any boy sit and look at them a whole evening and then see anything in ordinary everyday girls? It was almost worse than last Sunday at church, when Myra Lockley had been there, the guest of Dell Robinson. Pat couldn't keep her eyes off Myra's dazzling complexion. All her own, too, you could tell that. Pat was sure Myra spent the whole service gazing at the navy blue back of Harris Hines, who had taken a notion that day to sit in his family pew up front. She tried to tease Harris a little about Myra the next evening when they were skating on the moonlit pool. Harris had just laughed and said, "There was a Myra." At first, Pat was pleased. Then she wondered if the day would ever come when he would say, "There was a Patricia." Part 2. Her first love letter was another wonderful thing. Harris had gone to visit a friend in town, and Pat had never expected him to write her, but he did. Pat found the letter behind Judy's clock when she came home from school. "Sure, and I tucked it out of sight so that me bold city shouldn't be seeing it," whispered Judy. Pat was put to it to find a place wherein to read the sacred missive. At that moment there was somebody in every room of the house, even the poet's room, because Aunt Helen was at Silverbush for a visit. To read it in the kitchen where Judy was dressing a brace of fat hens was unthinkable. Pat had an inspiration. She got her snowshoes and was away through the silver bush, across the hill field, and through the woods. Soon she found the secret field, an untrodden level of spirit blue snow, where the wood queen and the fern princess were slender saplings now, the very spot for love letters. Seated on a gray longer under the maples, Pat read her letter. Little Queen, she'd always wondered, ever since she and Betts had read Ella Wheeler Wilcox's poems together, if anyone would ever call her Little Queen. "I can see you at this very moment, wonderful Patricia. I wish I could write you with a rose instead of a pen." And he was hers, unalterably Harris J. Hines. What did the J stand for? He would never tell anyone, but he had said, "I'll tell you what it is some day," in a tone implying that it was some beautiful secret that would affect their entire lives. "Oh, and how many kisses was there in your billy doo?" said Judy when Pat came home, her cheeks crimson from something more than her tramp in the frosty night. It was no use being angry with Judy. "They don't call them billets doo now, Judy," she said gravely. "They call them mash notes." "They would that, the uglier the better nowadays. There's something real romantic in the sound of Billy Doo. Now, Patsy darlint, you'll be writing back to him, but don't be forgetting that the writing words do be lasting." Pat had mislaid her fountain pen, and the family ink bottle was dry, so she hunted up her very prettiest pencil to answer it, the one Sid had given her on her birthday, all gold and blue with a big silk flame-colored tassel. Judy need not have worried over what Pat would write back. Her letter was really full of dainty mockery that made the devoted Harris more unalterably hers than ever. And, having written her letter, she wrapped the pencil in tissue paper and put it away in her glory box, vowing solemnly that it should never be used to write anything else, unless another letter to Harris. And she lay awake for hours with Harris's letter under her pillow. She did not want to waste this happy night sleeping. "But what," said Judy very slyly one day, "does Jingle be thinking of all this?" Pat winced. Hilary's attitude had been a secret thorn in her side all winter. She knew he hated Harris by the fact that he always was dourly silent when Harris was about. One evening, when Harris had been bragging a bit what several noted relatives of his had done, Judy could have told you all the Hineses bragged. Hilary had said quite nastily, "But what are you going to do?" Harris had been fine. He had just flung up his splendid crest and laughed kindly at Hilary, and when Hilary had turned away, Harris had whispered to Pat, "I'm going to win the most wonderful girl in P.E. Island, something no other Hines has ever done." Still, Pat hated to feel the little chill of alienation between her and Hilary. They never went to Happiness now. Of course, they hardly ever got gone in winter, and Hilary was studying very hard so that he had few footloose evenings to spend in Judy's kitchen. Harris, of course, never spent his evenings in the kitchen. He was entertained in the little parlor, where he was supposed to help Pat with her French and Latin. Sometimes Pat thought it would have been much jollier in the kitchen. There were times when, Latin and French being exhausted, she found herself with little to say. Though that didn't matter much, Harris had plenty for both. But when the beautiful copper beech at the top of the hill field blew down in a terrific March gale, it was Hilary who understood her grief and comforted her. Harris couldn't understand at all. Why such a fuss over an old tree? He laughed at her kindly, as an unreasonable child. Snap out of it, Pat. Are there any number of trees left in the world yet? There are any number of people left in the world when someone dies, but that doesn't mend the grief of those who loved him, said Hilary. Harris laughed. He always laughed when Hilary said anything. The moonstruck house builder, he called him, though never in Pat's hearing. Just at this moment, Pat found herself thinking that Harris's eyes were really too brown and glossy. Strange, she had never noticed it before, but Hilary understood. Darling Hilary. A wave of affection for him seemed to flood her being. Even when it ebbed, it seemed to have swept something away with it that had been there. She went to the picture with Harris that night, but it was a little flat, and Harris was really too possessive. He had his brother's cutter, and he was absurdly solicitous about the robes. I'm not quite senile yet, said Pat. Harris laughed. So it can scratch. Why could he never take anything seriously? When he lifted her out at the gate, Pat looked at Silverbush. It seemed to look back at her reproachfully. It struck her that she had been thinking more about Harris Hines that winter than of dear Silverbush. She was suddenly repentant. Aren't you ever going to kiss me, Pat? Harris was whispering. Perhaps, when you grow up, said Pat, and laughed too. Harris had driven angrily away, but Pat slept soundly, albeit it was their first tiff. Harris did not show himself at Silverbush for a week, and Sid and Winnie tormented her mercilessly about it. Pat wasn't worried, although Judy thought she might be. Boys do be like that now and then, Patsy. They take the queer notions. He'll be along some of these long come short stallant. I haven't a doubt of it, said Pat with a shrug. Meanwhile, I'll get a little real studying done. Part 3. Harris came back and everything was as before. Or was it? Where had the glamour gone? Pat felt a little disgusted with herself, and with Harris, and with the world in general. And then Harris went into Mr. Taylor's store in Silverbridge. There was no reason why a clerk in a dry goods store shouldn't be as romantic as anybody else, but it seemed such a terrible come down after all his Birdman talk. Pat felt as if he were a stranger. Mr. H. Jemuel Hines has taken a position with Mr. Taylor of Silverbridge, so ran one of the locals in the next paper, perhaps inspired by no friend of Hines. Jemuel! So that's what the J stood for. No wonder he wouldn't tell it, Pat giggled, as Judy read it out to her. Judy talked to herself as she kneaded her bread that night in a quiet kitchen, for everybody was out except Pat, who was studying in the little parlour. Sure, and the inn's near when she do be laughing at him, and not knowing why he should be ashamed of a good Bible name. Well, it's been a little experience like for her. She'll know better how to handle the next one. There was one final flare-up of romance the night she and Harris walked down the hill from Betsy's party. Harris had been very nice that evening, and he really would have been very handsome if his nose hadn't that frightful kink in it. His hair was wonderful, and he was a wonderful dancer, and it was a wonderful night. After all, there was no use, as Judy said, in expecting too much of any boy. They all had their little failings. It's cold. Hurry, she said impatiently. If Judy had heard that, she would have known that the end was nearer still. They went through the whispering lane, and Harris paused by the garden gate and drew her to him. Pat was looking at the garden, all sparkle and snow in the moonshine. How sweet it was, with its hidden secrets. Look, Harris, she said, and her voice rippled through a verse she loved. So white with frost my garden lies, so still, so white my garden is. Full sure the fields of paradise are not more fair than this. The streets of pearl, the gates of gold, are they indeed more peace possessed than this white pleasurance pure and cold against the amber west? Don't let's talk about the weather, Harris was saying. I want you only to think of me. The light went out of Pat's face as if someone had blown it out. Hilary would have loved that. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it seemed to say itself. Harris laughed. Harris certainly had a frightful knack of laughing at the wrong time. That sissy. I suppose he would moon over gardens and trees. Something clicked inside Pat's brain. He isn't a sissy, she cried. The idea of you calling him a sissy. You with your curls and your great soft cowy eyes, she finished, but in thought. Harris tightened his arm. It mustn't be cross, he said fatally. Pat stepped back and removed his arm. I don't want to see you again, Harris Jemuel Hines, she said clearly and distinctly. Harris found out eventually that she meant it. You're as fickle-minded as a breeze, were his bitter parting words. Pat was not worried over her fickleness, but she was rather worried over the conviction that Harris had always taken a bit too much for granted from the start. He was what horrid May Binney called horridly a fast worker, and she, Pat Gardner of Silver Bush, had fallen for it. Judy used a dreadful phrase sometimes of certain girls, a bit too willing. Have I been too willing? Pat asked herself solemnly. When it became manifest that Pat's case with Harris Hines was off, she was tormented a good deal. Bets was very sweet and understanding and comforting, but Pat did not feel entirely easy until she had talked the matter over with Judy. Oh, Judy, it was very exciting while it lasted, but it didn't last. Oh, darling, I never thought it would come to anything. You're too young for a serious side. He was just a bit of an excursion like for you. I wouldn't be after criticizing him as long as you had a liking for him, Pat. But wasn't he a bit too free and easy now? I do be liking the shy ones better, that don't be calling the cows by the first name at the second visit. And he do be standing with his legs far too apart for real elegance. Now, did you ever notice the way Jingle stands? Like a soldier. He do be such a different looking boy since he do be wearing better clothes and having his hair cut at Silverbridge, never to mention his stylish glasses. It was strange but rather nice just to feel quietly happy again, without thrills and chills and semi-demi-quavers. Sid and Hilary are better than all the beaux in the world, Judy. I'm never going to fall in love again. Not before the next time anyway, Patsy. There won't be a next time. Oh, it's much more comfortable not to be in love, I'm agreed. And would you be wanting that blue dress of yours much longer, darling? It's all gone under the arms, and it do just be the shade for that bit of blue scroll in my mat. Oh, you can have it, said Pat indifferently. She burnt the letter just as indifferently. Nevertheless, years after, when she came across a little tasseled pencil in an old box in the attic, she smiled and sighed. Hilary came in with his lean brown hands filled with the first Mayflowers for her, and they went off on a ramble to happiness. Sure, and it's the happy boy that Jingle is this blessed night, chuckled Judy. Friendship is much more satisfactory than love, Pat reflected before she went to sleep.